Cold, late autumn air sits in your lungs as you follow a narrow path above Bergen, where the ground is damp and quiet. It is the 29th of November, 1970, and the valley called Isdalen feels hushed beneath low grey light. A family out walking notices something unusual among the rocks and brush, and the ordinary rhythm of the day slows. Soon the scene becomes careful work. Photographs taken, footprints noted, small items marked and lifted with patience. The first question is not dramatic, just practical and deeply human. Who was she? There are signs of deliberate privacy, labels removed, belongings damaged in ways that make identification harder. In an era of paper records and local files, detectives begin building a timeline from the few steady facts they can hold. They write reports, seal evidence, and send samples away, knowing that answers sometimes take years to arrive. Tonight, you can sit with that early, quiet moment and watch what the case reveals when each detail is handled slowly. The officers who arrive in Isdalen that day move with a kind of quiet respect, because the valley isn't a stage. It's just a place where people hike, where fog comes and goes, where the city feels far away. They mark the position of the body, the pattern of stones nearby, and the scattered traces left in the brush. They note that some belongings look intentionally damaged, not broken by accident or weather, but handled with purpose. And within a short time, a practical escalation arrives, because someone recognizes that the woman has no identification. No wallet with a name, no papers that make the next step easy. So the focus shifts almost immediately from what happened to who is missing. That decision shapes everything that follows, because if you can't name her, you can't notify anyone. And if you can't notify anyone, you can't learn what her life looked like before this quiet valley. In the first hours, they search outward in careful rings. They look for luggage, a car, a companion, any sign that this was part of an ordinary trip. Instead, they find the feeling of a person who traveled light and traveled thoughtfully. There are objects that could have carried clues, but many are stripped of their easy labels. A coat without a tag, a bottle without a readable mark. Small things that should have been ordinary made deliberately less informative. You can picture the way an investigator would write that down, without adjectives, without drama. Label removed, markings scraped. Possible attempt to hinder identification. And then comes another development, quiet but important, when the scene team realizes the items aren't just random. They suggest the woman came prepared, not for hiking, but for passing through places without being remembered too clearly. That shifts the questions again, from accident to intention. It doesn't answer anything, but it changes what the detectives will look for next. In Bergen, the case file begins to grow. The first pages hold photographs from the valley, the weather noted, the time of discovery, the names of responding officers. Then come the lists. Every item found is described, measured, and placed into evidence. What can be dried is dried. What can be preserved is preserved. And what can be tested is sent away. Because in 1970, laboratory results are something you wait for. Sometimes you wait weeks, sometimes longer. The next decision point comes quickly, and you can feel it as a practical fork in the road. Do you treat this as a local unknown and focus on nearby missing persons reports? Or do you treat it as a traveler and widen the circle beyond Norway? The detectives choose to do both, but the order matters. They begin locally, because local records are reachable, and because a match close to home would be the simplest answer. They check missing persons files in Bergen and the surrounding districts. They look through reports of women who didn't return, whose families called and waited, whose last sightings were written down in careful handwriting, and each time the details don't line up. Height, age, dental work, clothing, timing. The file stays empty of a name. That absence becomes its own kind of evidence. Meanwhile, pathologists begin their work, quietly, methodically, in the way that's meant to help the living understand the dead. They record what they can with the tools of the time, including dental features and fingerprints. They note characteristics that might matter later, the kind you can compare across borders if the right request is made. But in this era, comparison depends on systems that don't always talk to each other. It depends on paper sent by mail, on phone calls made during office hours, on officials who have to decide if a request is worth the effort. The investigation keeps moving anyway, one small action leading to the next. Someone asks, where would a traveler keep her luggage if she didn't have it with her? Someone else thinks of the railway station, where people leave bags for a day or two or longer. So a detective goes to Bergen station and asks to see the storage records. And that is where the case takes a concrete step forward. Because there are suitcases, not in the valley, not near the scene, but waiting in the ordinary grid of a station locker system. They're logged and stored, like hundreds of others, but these two draw attention because they've been left behind. They're paid for, they're not collected. And in a case with no name, any abandoned luggage feels like a handhold. The suitcases are retrieved with the same care as the valley evidence. They aren't opened casually, they're brought into an evidence room, photographed from all sides, and opened in a controlled way. Inside, there are everyday things, but arranged with that same sensation of deliberate privacy. Clothing, toiletries, small personal items that should make a person easier to identify and yet feel arranged to do the opposite. One by one, the investigators catalogue what they see, and almost immediately, a repeating pattern shows itself. Labels are removed from clothing, brand names are cut away, marks that might place an item in a certain country or a certain store are scratched or sanded. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but it's consistent enough to suggest practice. That becomes the next development because practice implies a history. Someone who learned that labels can be traced. Someone who believed, for whatever reason, that being identified would be dangerous, or unwanted, or simply unacceptable. The detectives don't need a spy story to recognize the behavior. They just need to recognize that it isn't random. In the suitcases, they also find small papers, the kind that usually help you build a timeline, a note with odd groupings of letters and numbers, a scrap of packaging, a receipt, or something close to a receipt, that anchors an item to a place. And then comes another step forward when they find that some items in the luggage connect to Bergen in a very plain way. A shop, a street, a purchase that suggests she was in town before she went to the valley. So now the detectives have a new task. They need to reconstruct the days leading up to the 29th of November, not through a person's friends or family, but through transactions, through rooms rented, through meals paid for, through the quiet footprints travelers leave in other people's ledgers. In 1970, that means hotel registers. It means handwritten cards behind a desk. It means clerks who remember faces if they've seen them enough times. It means a kind of patient door-knocking that isn't dramatic, just steady. So they begin where travelers often begin, the hotels near the station, the ones used by people passing through. They ask to see guest books. They ask managers if anyone remembers a woman traveling alone, paying cash, keeping to herself. At first, the answers are vague. Bergen gets visitors. And in late autumn, a solitary traveler doesn't always stand out. But then, slowly, a pattern forms. A clerk recognizes a description, not confidently, not with certainty, but enough to pull a register and point to a signature. The name is unfamiliar, and it doesn't match any missing persons report, but it's something. An alias, likely, but written in a hand that can be compared. And that becomes a new development, because now the detectives can search for the same handwriting in other places. They can look for the same slant, the same way letters are joined, the same pressure on the page. They start checking other hotels in Bergen, then beyond Bergen, following the natural routes a traveler might take. And they find more names, different nationalities implied by spelling, but the writing looks similar. The behavior looks similar. Cash payments, requests for certain rooms. Sometimes a preference for being placed away from the street, away from other guests. The timeline begins to stretch, not days but weeks. It suggests she moved through Norway with intention, staying briefly, leaving little, moving again. Each hotel adds a small piece, a date, a room number, a note made by a clerk, and each piece leads to another decision because the detectives have to choose what counts as reliable. A hotel register might be real, but the name might not be. A memory might be sincere, but it might also be influenced by the questions being asked. So they do what careful investigators do. They separate documents from recollections. They prioritize what can be photographed, copied, and preserved. They gather the register cards and send handwriting samples for analysis. They compare the ink, the stroke, the rhythm of the signatures. They build a chart, the kind you can imagine pinned inside a folder, listing dates and places in neat lines. And the chart keeps pointing back to the same absence. No confirmed identity, no passport number that matches an official record. No family calling from another country to ask if someone has been seen. The case is active now, not because there's a chase, but because the work has something to hold. It's still an identification problem, just a larger one. As the file grows, more details from the suitcases become important. There are items that suggest changes in appearance, different sets of clothing that don't quite match each other in style. Hair-related items that hint she may have altered her look. Small cosmetic choices that could shift how a witness would describe her. None of this is proof of espionage or conspiracy. It's simply evidence of someone who didn't want to be fixed in one description. The detectives treat it cautiously, because cautious is how you keep a case from drifting into imagination. They focus on what can be documented, what can be measured, what can be compared. They also notice the coded-looking notes again, and this becomes another development. If the notes are codes, they might be addresses or schedules. If they're not codes, they might still be personal shorthand, a way to remember hotels and dates without writing them plainly. So the investigators copy the notes carefully and begin trying simple interpretations. They compare the sequences to the hotel timeline they're building. They see if certain letters could represent cities. They see if numbers might line up with dates, or room numbers, or train lines. It's slow work, and it's easy to get lost. So they make another decision. They decide not to force a solution from the notes yet. They place them in the file as anomalies, and they move forward with what is clearer. The clearer path is to keep rebuilding her route. Train stations, ferry crossings, where tickets are bought and stamped. In 1970, there is no universal digital record. There are paper tickets, and there are memories, and there are ledgers kept by different offices, so a detective might call a station and ask a clerk to search old records, if those records still exist. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they've been discarded. Sometimes they're in a back room that smells like dust and machine oil. And every time a record can't be found, that's not a failure of effort. It's simply the reality of the time. The woman's travel style fits that reality too. Cash, short stays, few connections. If you wanted to move without leaving a clean trail, this would be how. That recognition brings another quiet escalation, because it suggests the case might not resolve quickly. A person who planned to be untraceable is harder to trace. It's a simple cause and effect, so the investigators widen the circle again. They share details with other Norwegian districts. They ask, "Have you had a traveler matching this description?" They send photographs, including images from the hotel registers and the belongings. They request checks against known missing persons lists beyond Bergen, but the responses come back thin. No match, no strong lead, and still the file grows heavier. At this point, you can imagine the evidence room. Metal shelves, cardboard boxes, brown paper envelopes labeled with dates and case numbers. The suitcases themselves, now emptied, still present as objects that carried a life. The investigators keep returning to them because suitcases are like compressed biographies. What you pack shows what you think you'll need. What you remove shows what you don't want known. One detective might handle a piece of clothing and note the stitching, the fabric, the way it's been altered. Another might study a bottle and wonder where it was bought. And someone else might focus on the most basic tools of identification available: fingerprints, dental records, because those can't be improvised as easily as names on a hotel card. So they take the fingerprints and prepare them for comparison. They request dental chart checks, first within Norway, then beyond, where possible. This is another development, because it's a shift from storytelling to biology, from witness memories to something more fixed. And yet, even fixed things need a matching record. A fingerprint is only useful if the person has been printed somewhere before. A dental chart is only useful if a dentist somewhere has kept records that can be compared. So the detectives send requests to other countries within the limits of what can be done at the time. It's not immediate. It's letters. It's official channels. It's waiting. While they wait, they keep working the local details. Because patience isn't passive. They revisit hotels. They ask clerks again, this time with specific dates. They ask about accents, languages, behaviors. And the witnesses offer small, human observations. A woman who seemed private, a woman who sometimes asked about the view, a woman who requested a different room then changed her mind, a woman who spoke with an accent that wasn't consistent, or perhaps only seemed inconsistent, because memory is a soft thing. Those memories are treated carefully, not dismissed, but not inflated, because each memory, if handled too roughly, becomes a story instead of a fact. One clerk might say she spoke German. Another might say she spoke English. Someone else might recall French words. And the investigators have to make another decision. They decide to record each claim, but they don't pick one language as the truth. Not yet. Instead, they look for what overlaps: cash payments, solitary travel, short stays, repeated pattern of names that don't lead anywhere. And that overlap becomes the backbone of the timeline. As December approaches, the case meets the first real pressure of time, not because evidence disappears overnight, but because leads cool quietly. A clerk's memory fades. A hotel register might be archived. A witness might move away. So investigators push to gather as many statements as they can while the details are still reachable. That effort produces another concrete development, when they identify more than one alias, and the same handwriting ties them together. The handwriting analysis doesn't give them a real name, but it gives them something steadier than memory: a consistent hand moving across different counters in different towns. So they begin treating the aliases like breadcrumbs, not identities. And they look for the places where those breadcrumbs touch something official. A hotel card might list a passport number, or a home address, or a date of birth, even if the name is borrowed. And in more than one register there are small, neat details, the kind clerks asked for out of routine rather than suspicion. The detectives copy everything letter by letter, because in an investigation like this, you don't trust your eyes alone. You build a second set of eyes on paper. They also begin looking for the rooms themselves, not because the room will solve anything, but because rooms are physical, and physical things can hold on to traces longer than people do. A manager might remember where the guests sat at breakfast. A cleaner might remember an unusual request. A night porter might remember a wakeful traveler who asked about train times. Most of what comes back is gentle and ordinary. She kept to herself. She paid in cash. She didn't leave a forwarding address. But every so often, a witness offers a detail that feels like it was noticed in the moment, not rebuilt afterward. One person remembers she asked for a room with a balcony. Another remembers she didn't want a room at the front of the building. And someone else remembers she changed rooms after looking out the window, as if deciding whether she could be seen. None of those things prove fear. They prove attention. And attention is something the investigators can work with, because it implies method. By early December, the timeline on the detective's desk has enough points that they can draw lines between them. Not perfect lines, not the kind you'd see in a modern database, but hand-drawn connections between dates, towns, and hotel names. Bergen appears more than once. So do other places along the western and southern routes, the kind of towns travelers pass through when they're moving by rail and ferry. When the same handwriting appears again, it's like hearing the same footstep on a different street. It doesn't tell you who is walking, it tells you it's the same walker. At the same time, the suitcases keep giving up their own small truths. The inventory list grows longer. Clothing, cosmetics, small containers, and personal items that should have made her more visible, but were arranged to make her less so. Some garments have their tags cut cleanly away, some have brand marks sanded or rubbed down, as if someone took time with them, not just seconds. And that becomes a quiet development in the file, because it tells investigators this wasn't done in a rush. It was done when she had privacy. It was done when she had time. There are also things that suggest a traveler used to changing presentation. Different styles of clothing, different kinds of shoes, and grooming items that hint she might have adjusted her hair. The detectives don't announce this as disguise. They write it down as variability, as the practical possibility that one woman could be described in more than one way. And that matters, because witness statements depend on stability. If you change your hair, your posture, even your makeup, you change how people remember you. And if you do it often, you become harder to anchor. So, the police ask a new set of questions. Not, did you see this woman? But, did you see a woman who seemed to be performing normal travel, while also guarding her privacy with unusual care? It's a softer question, and it gets softer answers, but sometimes those are the ones that last. In Bergen, attention turns toward the railway station itself again. The lockers are ordinary, but the transaction isn't. Someone paid to store 2 suitcases and then left them. That suggests planning, but also interruption. Either she didn't intend to return, or something changed. The detectives check the station records for payments. They ask who handled the locker area. They ask if any staff remember a woman with 2 cases traveling alone. Most don't. It's a busy place and memories blur. But the paper doesn't blur as easily. The station logs show dates, sometimes times, sometimes the method of payment. And this is where another careful decision is made. They start assuming she moved randomly, and they start assuming she moved according to a personal system. A system that might be visible if you lay it out fully. So they create a master chart. Hotels on one axis, dates on the other. Aliases listed beside each stay. Notes from witnesses attached like small flags. And beside it, they pin copies of the coded notes found among her things. Those codes become less intimidating when they're treated like a diary, not a cipher meant for war. Just a shorthand meant for a single person. A way to write down, for example, a hotel name without writing it plainly. A way to mark a date without making it obvious. The detectives test this gently. They line up a code that begins with a letter, and they compare it to a city on the same date. They notice that some of the codes seem to match the pattern of her known movements. Not perfectly, but enough to suggest the notes might be a private travel log. That gives the investigation a new kind of momentum. Because if the notes correspond to her route, then the notes might also include stops the police haven't found yet. Stops where she stayed under another alias. Stops where someone might remember something more specific. And the consequence is simple. The search area expands. They begin contacting hotels in other towns that match the likely route. Some calls are answered by managers who are helpful and calm. Others are answered by staff who are busy or skeptical, or simply unsure they're allowed to share anything. So official letters follow. Requests for register checks on specific dates, requests for copies of guest cards. And each letter means waiting, days, weeks. The rhythm of investigation settling into its true pace. While those letters travel, the forensic work continues. Fingerprints are prepared for comparison. Dental features are charted carefully. The investigators send inquiries to other jurisdictions, asking if any unknown woman, any missing traveler, any record in their files might match. This is not a single phone call. It's a stack of correspondence, each with its own timeline. And each reply, when it arrives, is an envelope that has to be opened slowly, because hope has to be handled gently in work like this. Many responses are negative. No match in local missing persons. No match in the available fingerprint files. No dental comparison found. Each one is filed, not discarded, because future investigators will need to know what was checked and when. And that is how a case stays alive, even when it isn't moving. Back in the evidence room, the suitcases are reconsidered again, this time with a slightly different mindset. If she was careful about labels, then the few labels she missed might matter more than usual. If she was careful about documents, then any scrap of paper becomes valuable. The detectives recheck the contents for overlooked markings. A laundry stamp, a tailor's thread, a manufacturer's code in a seam, a cosmetic bottle with lettering too small to notice at first. And slowly, a few small anchors appear. Not anchors that give her a name, but anchors that suggest regions. A product that is more commonly sold in one country than another. A piece of clothing with a stitching style that looks familiar to a specialist. A container that might have come from a certain shop chain. These are not decisive, but they narrow the imagination. They keep the case in the world of commerce and travel rather than fantasy. Another development arrives when the investigators begin comparing witness language reports more systematically. Instead of asking what language did she speak, they ask, what did you actually hear? Did she order in German? Or did she just have a German-sounding accent? Did she use English words? Or did she simply understand English spoken to her? Did she respond in one language and then switch? When you ask it that way, the answers become more modest. A witness might say, I heard her say a few words that sounded like German. Another might say, she spoke English but with an accent I couldn't place. And this becomes important because it allows for a person who could navigate in several languages without belonging clearly to any one place. You can imagine how that sits on the page. Not a conclusion, a possibility, a tool for the next interview. The detectives also begin asking about her manner, not to psychoanalyze, but to capture repeatable behavior. Did she carry herself as someone used to hotels? Did she ask procedural questions? Did she avoid leaving items behind? Did she seem to notice who else was present? Witnesses often describe her as polite, reserved, sometimes particular. And that word, particular, appears more than once. By mid-December, the case has a working reconstruction. Not a full story, but a route, a set of stays under different names, a pattern of cash payments, and the final movement toward Bergen and then out into the valley. The question the detectives now face is not whether she traveled, it's why she traveled in a way that resisted being followed. They consider ordinary explanations first. A person escaping a personal situation. A person with debts. A person with reasons to be private that don't involve governments or secrets. These possibilities are written down because investigators have to protect themselves from stories that are too neat. But they also consider the practical signs of tradecraft not as a label but as a description of habit. Removed labels. Multiple aliases. Short stays. A careful choice of rooms. A traveler who didn't want to be photographed by memory. The consequence is another decision. They begin looking for any reports of similar behavior at the same hotels. Other guests who paid cash and used aliases. Any sign of a network. This is difficult because hotels don't keep lists of suspicious guests, at least not in that time, not in that setting. So the detectives ask for something simpler. Did anyone see her with company? Did anyone see her meeting someone in a lobby? Did anyone see her speaking with a man at breakfast or with a woman by the entrance? Most witnesses say no, but a few offer uncertain memories. A figure seen briefly near a table, a conversation glimpsed at a distance. Details that don't settle but don't disappear either. Those uncertain memories are filed as what they are, unconfirmed. They don't become a central theory. They become a reminder that solitude can be real and also performative. Sometimes a person is alone. Sometimes a person is alone in public and connected in private. The police hold both possibilities without forcing either. As the year turns, There is a quiet shift in the case. The immediate rush of interviews slows. Hotels return to their routines. Witnesses go back to their jobs. And the investigators find themselves waiting on the long channels, forensic comparisons, international requests, lab results. This is where a cold case begins, not with abandonment, but with the slow thinning of new information. In that thinning period, the file becomes more organized. You can almost see it. Folders within folders, timeline sheets, photographs in sleeves, the suitcases documented in full, the codes copied and copied again, so handling the original isn't necessary. The kind of care that assumes someone will reopen this later. Someone who will need to know what was done and what wasn't. Another development comes when investigators work back from the last confirmed sightings. They establish the most reliable point where she was seen alive. In the ordinary sense, as a hotel guest, as a customer, as a traveler. They narrow the window, they check transport options out of Bergen. They consider how a person would reach the area near Isdalen without attracting attention. Taxi, bus, walking from a stop. Each option is checked against what evidence exists. In 1970, many of these movements leave no record at all, and that absence is not suspicious by itself. It's simply the way the world worked. The detectives do something that looks simple, but takes time. They create a map, not a modern digital map, but a physical one, with pins. Bergen, the railway station, each hotel she stayed at, each town that appears to align with the codes, and then the valley. When you stand back from it, the geography becomes its own clue. She wasn't moving randomly across Norway. She was moving in a corridor of travel, along places that connect well by ordinary transport. That suggests planning without requiring a dramatic explanation. But still, there's the problem of the name. The aliases are many, and none of them match a missing person report. The fingerprints are taken, but there is no match in the files that can be reached. The dental chart exists, but no dentist comes forward with a comparison. And so the case begins to lean more heavily on preservation, on the careful storage of evidence, on writing down every step, on preparing for a future where identification might work differently. It's during this period that photographs and descriptions are prepared for wider circulation, not as spectacle. As a request, a quiet, respectful attempt to let someone, somewhere recognize a face. The wording matters. The police don't want rumors to run ahead of facts. They don't want an unknown woman reduced to a story people tell. They want an answer, and they want it with dignity. So the materials are distributed with care. Other districts, some international contacts. The kind of channels Norway had access to, the kind that depended on cooperation and patience. And then, again, waiting. Mail moving over borders. Officials checking files. People looking at photographs and deciding, no, I don't know her. Or perhaps thinking they do, but not being sure enough to say it out loud. As you sit with this stage of the investigation, you begin to feel how the case becomes heavy. Not heavy with drama, heavy with unreturned certainty. Everything the detectives do is reasonable. Everything follows from the evidence. And still, the name stays out of reach. There is also the matter of the woman's personal choices, the things she did that shaped the investigation. Label removal isn't just about hiding brands. It removes potential witnesses. A shopkeeper might recognize a unique coat bought last month. A tailor might remember altering a dress with a particular lining. A laundry might have a record connected to a marked garment. When those marks are gone, those paths go quiet. And the detectives can't reopen paths that no longer exist. The file notes these consequences plainly: difficulties with identification due to removed labels, difficulties due to multiple aliases, difficulties due to cash payments. Each difficulty is a door that closes softly, not slammed, just no longer opening. And then comes a point that every investigation reaches sooner or later. A midpoint that cannot be undone. The body cannot be held indefinitely. There are legal and practical realities, And there is the human truth that a person deserves a resting place, even when their name is unknown. So arrangements are made. Documentation is completed. The unidentified woman is given a burial, a respectful conclusion to what can be concluded, while the questions remain. This is an irreversible moment, because it changes what investigators can do in the future. Certain examinations become harder, certain comparisons become dependent on the quality of the records already taken, and so around this time, the investigators double down on preservation. They ensure fingerprints are stored correctly. They ensure dental charts are detailed. They ensure photographs are archived. They ensure the contents of the suitcases are catalogued in a way that a future officer could understand without having been there. The consequence is that the case becomes two things at once: an active search for identity and an archive built for the future. Years later, people will call this the moment the case went cold. But in the file, it doesn't look like coldness. It looks like maintenance. It looks like a case that is still open, but no longer moving quickly. What keeps it moving, even slowly, are the little details that won't stay settled. Some are written in ink. Some are remembered in passing. Some are tucked into the suitcases like thoughts folded small. In the months after the burial, detectives return to the coded notes again and again. They do it the way you'd return to a difficult paragraph in a book, hoping the meaning will meet you halfway. Each time they try not to invent, they try to match. The notes are short. They look like clusters of letters paired with numbers. At first glance, they could be anything: a cipher, a list, a private shorthand. But the most patient approach is also the simplest. Assume it's a travel log. So the investigators begin laying the codes alongside the dates they already know from hotel registers. They look for patterns, not answers. They ask, when the register says she was in Bergen, does any code resemble Bergen? When the register says she was in Stavanger, does any code share letters that could point there? Slowly, a rough correspondence begins to appear. Not perfect, not enough to declare solved, but enough to justify another development in the file. The detectives decide to treat the codes as possible place markers. That decision changes their next steps. Instead of only searching for the aliases they already found, they start searching for the stops implied by the codes. They circle towns that match the likely routes. They contact hotels in those towns, asking them to check old guest books around certain dates. And because this is 1970 and 1971, the process is physical. Letters are typed, copies are made, envelopes are stamped. Then it's waiting again. In some towns, the old registers still exist. A manager pulls a heavy book from a shelf. Pages smell faintly of dust and soap. Names are written in neat lines, the daily record of ordinary travel. But a register is only useful if the entry is legible and complete. And even then, an alias is still an alias. So the detectives keep working in layers. First, find an entry that matches the date. Then compare the handwriting. Then compare the behavior. Cash, solitary, short stay, a preference for a certain kind of room. Sometimes they find a possible match, a name that isn't on the missing persons lists, a signature that looks like the others, a nationality written down that could be real or could be another borrowed skin. Each time this happens, the timeline extends. Another dot goes onto the map. Another small rectangle appears on the chart, and each new dot brings a consequence that is both helpful and frustrating. Helpful because her route becomes clearer, frustrating because the route still leads nowhere familiar. It's like following footsteps across fresh snow, only to reach a road where the tracks vanish into traffic. There are other anomalies too, quieter but persistent. The mix of currencies found with her belongings, Norwegian kroner and foreign money as well. A traveller carrying several kinds of cash is not unusual, especially in Europe. But in this case, it fits the larger pattern of avoiding systems. Cash doesn't require a name. Cash doesn't ask for a signature. Cash doesn't leave a bank trail, at least not an easy one. So the detectives document the currencies carefully. What was found? What denominations? what might suggest recent exchange, and what might suggest she'd carried it for some time. They consider whether any of it could be traced. In 1970, tracing banknotes is not a realistic path, not at scale, and not without a reason to suspect a particular transaction. But the inquiry itself has value. It makes the detectives ask where she might have exchanged money: at a bank, at a hotel desk, at a kiosk, at a ferry terminal. Each possibility leads to a new set of questions. Were there any exchange receipts? Were there any telememories? Were there any records kept? And again, the world answers with its limits. Many exchanges leave no record that survives. Many clerks don't remember a single face among hundreds. Even so, detectives still do the work. They check the most likely places. They ask calmly. They take notes. They learn which questions produce nothing and which questions produce even a small detail. The file thickens with negative results, and that matters because it defines the shape of what's missing. Another strand that won't settle is witness memory. In an early case, witnesses are like lanterns along a path. In a later case, those lanterns dim, not because anyone is lying, because time changes the brightness of recall. In this investigation, several witnesses remembered her accent differently. Some said German, some said French, some said English with something else underneath. And the detectives keep returning to that because language can be a clue that travels across borders. They start rereading statements side by side, not to choose a winner, to notice what might be consistent. Was the witness fluent in the language they claimed they heard? Did they only hear a few words? Was the conversation long enough to judge? Was the environment noisy? Did the witness write the statement immediately or weeks later? These are gentle questions, but they help separate observation from interpretation. And that separation becomes another development. The investigators begin to classify witness statements by reliability markers. Immediate statements are marked as stronger. Later recollections are marked as softer. Statements from people familiar with languages are noted differently than statements from people who guessed. This approach doesn't produce a name, but it stabilizes the file. It prevents the case from being pulled back and forth by the most confident voice. In a mystery like this, confidence is not evidence. Consistency is closer. With the witness statements reorganized, the detectives look again at the hotel register details. Some of the alias entries include claimed addresses. Some include birth dates. Some include passport numbers, written down because the clerk asked. Each of these is an invitation to check something official, and so they do. They attempt to verify the passport numbers. They contact relevant authorities where possible. They ask if the number format matches a real issuance pattern. They ask if the address exists. They ask if the person exists under that name. In many cases, the answers come back negative. The number does not correspond. The address is incomplete. The person is not found. And this leads to a clear consequence. The woman likely used false documentation, or at least false details, with enough skill to pass a hotel desk. A hotel desk is not a border checkpoint. In 1970, many hotels did not have the means or the reason to verify a passport on the spot. So the file begins to carry two truths at once. She presented as a normal traveler, and she traveled in a way that resisted later verification. Those truths can coexist without requiring a grand narrative. They describe a method. As winter deepens, the case continues to be worked, but with fewer new doors to knock on. The early wave of obvious checks has been done. The missing persons lists, local and some international. The first forensic comparisons. The hotel canvas in the most likely corridor. What remains now is second pass work. Rechecks. Overlooked details. And the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, will recognize the photographs and speak up. That hope is handled carefully, because public recognition is unpredictable. A person can be sure they know a face, and be wrong. A person can be right and never see the photograph. A person can see it and decide not to get involved. So investigators keep the case in the realm of documentation. They focus on things they can prove. and they keep the rest in a separate category, interesting but unconfirmed. One of the most stubborn details in the file is the condition of the belongings, not the dramatic parts, the small practical parts. The way labels were removed, the way some items were altered, the way certain objects were chosen and others were avoided. A detective might hold a sweater and note the careful cut where a tag should be. Not torn, not frayed. Cut, that suggests scissors, time, light, a moment of privacy. The file begins to reflect this as behavioral evidence, not who she was, but how she lived while traveling. Orderly, intentional, not careless. And the consequence is that random explanations become less satisfying. A lost tourist becomes less likely. A person moving with a personal mission, whatever that mission was, becomes more likely. But a mission is not a name, and the case still needs a name. In the early 1970s, Norwegian police do what they can to extend identification attempts. Fingerprints are circulated again. Dental charts are sent again. Photographs are shared again. The work is repetitive, but repetition is how you build a safety net. In a long case, you want future investigators to know that the same question was asked more than once, in more than one way. Some of these efforts produce a small shift, not an identity, but a stronger sense of origin, or at least of possible origin. Items in the luggage are examined by specialists. Textiles, cosmetics, manufacturing marks in seams. Even when labels are removed, garments can still carry hidden signatures, a thread type, a zipper brand, a button style. A specialist might say a certain item is more common in Central Europe. Another might note a cosmetic product sold more widely in one region than another. These are not decisive, but they narrow the field, and narrowing is a kind of progress. It's the opposite of a case drifting into myth. As these assessments are added to the file, detectives also look at the woman's movements within Bergen itself. This is a city with a port, with rail lines, with ferries, with business travelers. They ask, where did she go during the day? What shops might she have visited? What streets might she have walked? In 1970, there are no card payments to reconstruct a route, but there are still possible sources. Shopkeepers, taxi dispatch logs, if any exist, bar or restaurant staff, laundry services. These are small, local questions, and they are time-consuming. A detective might walk into a shop and describe her. The shopkeeper might shrug, or might think for a long moment, and then say, perhaps. Perhaps she bought a scarf. Perhaps she asked about something. Perhaps she looked at postcards. The detectives learn quickly that these leads are fragile, and fragile leads require gentle handling. If you press too hard, you distort them. So they record the maybes, and they keep going. Because a case like this is built out of maybes, carefully weighted. Another anomaly in the file is the question of why Isdalen. The valley is known locally not as a tourist center, but as a place people hike. It's close enough to Bergen to reach, but remote enough to feel private, and the route to it can be navigated without much official attention. A bus, partway, a taxi if you choose, a walk. Investigators ask, did she know the valley? Did someone tell her about it? Was it chosen for solitude or for some other reason? Those questions are written down, but they don't have answers. Not yet. And then, as the investigation settles into its first long stretch, something else begins to happen. The case begins to attract stories, not from the police, from the world outside the file. People hear that a woman died without a name, and they add their own meanings. They imagine espionage. They imagine secret meetings. They imagine a life built entirely of disguise. The investigators, and later researchers, have to make another decision: how to let the public know enough to help without letting speculation flood the evidence. In a case with so few anchors, a flood can wash away what little clarity exists. So the official communications remain measured. Photographs, basic description, dates, places, a request for information, nothing more. Inside the file, the detectives keep returning to what is actually present. Suitcases, hotel cards, codes, witness statements, graded and filed, forensic reports, and within that material there are a few details that remain strangely sharp. One is the consistency of the handwriting. Another is the deliberate pattern of erasing identifying marks. Another is the way she moved through certain places more than once. Bergen, in particular, keeps returning. So the detectives ask a question that is both simple and difficult. Why Bergen? What drew her there repeatedly? If you can answer that, you might find the network around her, even if she traveled alone. Business, shipping, industry, international visitors. Bergen is a doorway city, and a doorway city is useful to many kinds of travelers. They look again at the hotels she chose. Not the fanciest, not the cheapest. Places that would not draw attention. Places where staff are used to foreign guests. Places near transport. This is another development because it frames her choices as practical. She chose hotels like a person who understood logistics. The file begins to include small notes on hotel locations. Distance to station, distance to port, ease of leaving quickly, room placement if known, a preference for rooms with certain views or away from others. These details are mundane, but together they form a portrait of method. As the months pass, the detective work becomes less about gathering and more about rereading. This is a strange stage of investigation because the work is internal. You sit at a desk, you open folders, you read the same statements again, but you read them with more context than before. A detail that seemed meaningless at first can become meaningful later, once the timeline is longer. For example, a witness who mentioned a particular bag. At first, it's just a bag. Later, after the suitcases are found, the bag detail might confirm that the same woman was seen in the lobby, or a witness who mentioned sunglasses. At first, it's just an accessory. Later, it might align with an item in the luggage list and tighten the connection between an alias and a real presence. This is patient work. It is also humble work. It requires admitting that the answer might not come from a new clue, but from a better understanding of an old one. Somewhere in this period, the file begins to show another quiet shift. The case is no longer only local police work. It becomes something that touches national systems. Questions about borders, questions about passports, questions about international travel routes. In 1970, those systems exist, but they are less integrated than they would be later. So every inquiry across borders takes effort, and sometimes it takes personal relationships between agencies. The investigators send information out again. They keep it factual. Dental chart details, fingerprints if the channels allow. Photographs, descriptions of clothing, though labels are missing. The list of aliases, in case any of them appear elsewhere. And then they wait. If you imagine yourself as the detective assigned to watch this case, this is the stage where you learn the difference between work and motion. You can work every day, and still the case might not move. But your work matters because it holds the possibility open. It prevents the file from becoming just a box on a shelf. There is also the question of whether any of the woman's possessions could be traced by origin, even without labels. Some items may have been purchased in Norway, so detectives check shops in Bergen. They bring photographs of certain items. Where possible, they ask if the product is sold there. If the packaging matches, if any staff remember a foreign woman buying it in the days before the 29th of November, most do not. But sometimes, a shopkeeper can tell you something else. They can tell you this brand is not common here, or this kind of bottle is usually imported from a certain country, or this packaging style changed last year, so it was likely purchased recently. These are small, practical facts, and they go into the file. The codes, the currencies, and the travel methods begin to sit together in a new way. They begin to look like a person maintaining multiple options, multiple routes, multiple identities, multiple ways to pay. If one path fails, another remains. That's not proof of anything dramatic. It is simply a description of behavior that avoids dependence. And when investigators see avoidance of dependence, They also consider whether the woman had help, not necessarily a companion in the hotel lobby. Help can be quiet, a phone call, an arranged address, a contact in another city, a person she met briefly and then left. In a time before mobile phones, arranging help requires planning. It requires meeting points, or mail drops, or phone booths. So detectives look for evidence of communication. In the suitcases, are there address books? Are there letters? Are there phone numbers? They find very little, and the little they do find is hard to interpret. Which leads to another consequence. If she had contacts, they were not written down in an obvious way, or they were removed before the end. Sometimes, investigators considered the possibility that she was never reported missing, not because nobody cared, but because her circumstances made reporting difficult. If she lived alone, if she was estranged, if she moved often, if she used different names. A missing report begins with a person who knows what name to give the police. If the name itself is unstable, the whole system struggles. This is a quiet but important realization, because it explains how a person could disappear without creating a matching file somewhere else. The world's systems rely on stable identities, and the Isdal woman, whoever she was, moved as if stability was optional. In time, the case becomes a kind of teaching file within the police culture, not formally, perhaps, but practically. It demonstrates the limits of the era. It shows how quickly paper trails can fade. It shows how a person who removes labels can remove future witnesses. It shows why preservation matters. And because it teaches those things, the file is handled with a kind of care that is unusual. Not frantic care, archival care. Evidence is checked for storage conditions. Boxes are resealed. Photographs are protected. Reports are copied. The goal is not to keep working the same dead-end leads forever. The goal is to keep the case in a state where future tools can be applied. And then within the file there is an uncomfortable category. Information that was received but cannot be confirmed. Tips, rumors, people calling to say they think they know who she was. People suggesting she belonged to one country or another. In a high-profile unknown person case, these tips arrive even without media frenzy. Human beings do not like unanswered questions. They want to fill the blank. The detectives have to be careful. They record the tips. They note who provided them. They ask what the tip is based on. A memory, a photograph, a conversation overheard years ago, and then they look for a way to test it. If it cannot be tested, it stays in the file, but it does not steer the case. Over time, this becomes another reason the case cools, not lack of effort, the lack of testable new information. A file can contain 100 suggestions and still have no usable lead. That is not a failure of imagination. It is a success of discipline. When you're working a file like this, you start learning which questions can be answered and which ones can only be carried. A careful detective, the kind who doesn't rush, will sometimes do something that looks like going backward. They'll return to the original scene notes and reread them as if they were written by someone else. Not because the first work was careless, because time changes what you notice and context changes what a detail can mean. So, the Valley notes come back onto the desk. The photographs are laid out again. The inventory from the scene is compared line by line to the inventory from the suitcases. The aim is simple, to see if anything that was found in Isdalen should have been in the luggage, or vice versa. That comparison leads to a small but meaningful decision. Investigators begin treating the suitcases as the primary biography and the valley as the final page. They ask, what was missing from the suitcases that a traveler would normally keep? And what was present that a normal traveler wouldn't bother to carry? One thing that keeps returning across these reviews is how little written communication she left behind. No obvious address book, no bundle of letters, no postcards with affectionate handwriting. It doesn't prove she had no one. It simply means if she had connections, she kept them off paper. That has a direct consequence for the investigation. Without names and addresses, you can't do the ordinary work of notification. You can't call a sister or a friend or an employer. You can only ask institutions, and institutions answer slowly. So the case shifts, gradually, into a second mode. Less door knocking, more record checking, more lab work, more careful preservation, so the future can take another turn at the same locks. And then, as the months turn into years, the world itself changes around the file. Not dramatically, just steadily. Hotels change managers. Clerks retire. Paper registers get moved into storage, or destroyed, or simply lost in renovations. A station is remodeled, and the old locker system is replaced, and someone throws away a stack of forms because they don't look important. If you've ever worked in an office, you know how this happens. Not through malice, through routine. And routine is one of the quiet enemies of old cases. So the investigators who remain attached to the case, even loosely, begin to do something else. They start building redundancy. They copy key documents. They re-photograph photographs. They write summaries that future readers can understand. They're trying to protect the work from time. In Norway, as elsewhere, policing in the 1970s and 1980s becomes more standardized. There's a growing sense of how important it is to keep records that can be revisited. And the Isdal Woman file benefits from that. It becomes one of those cases people remember exists, even if they can't solve it. A detail that helps the case endure is that so much of it is physical. 2 suitcases, clothing, small objects, paper scraps with codes, photographs, fingerprints preserved, dental charts. This matters because physical evidence can be reinterpreted. A witness memory fades, but a seam in a garment stays a seam. A chemical residue stays what it is, even if you can't test it yet, and the coded notes stay patient on the page. At some point, a later review begins to treat the coded notes with a more structured approach, not as a romantic cipher, as a practical system. Investigators and researchers notice that some of the letter clusters resemble abbreviated place names. When you think like a traveler, the numbers might correspond to dates, written in a compressed way. So, they test a method. They take the confirmed hotel stays, and they convert those dates into simple number forms, the way you might jot them quickly. Then they look for similar number patterns in the notes. Where a match is plausible, they see if the letter cluster could align to a town name. This doesn't unlock everything, but it does something more important. It produces a working key, a partial translation that makes the notes less mysterious and more usable. And once you can use them, you can compare them. The comparison leads to another development. Some codes appear to indicate stops that were not initially found in the hotel canvas, not because police missed them through negligence, because the canvas focused on a corridor and the notes suggest she occasionally stepped outside it, a night here, a brief stay there, a detour that doesn't look important until you see it on a map. So the map changes again. New pins are added. New towns appear on the paper. And with each new pin comes a new letter, a new request, a new search through old guest books if they still exist. Sometimes a hotel can confirm an entry. Sometimes they can't find the register anymore. And sometimes they find it, but the handwriting is too faint, or the page is damaged, or the relevant date is missing. Each outcome is recorded, because knowing what you can't know is also part of the truth. Another strand that gets more attention in later years is the question of her appearance and how witnesses described it. Early descriptions can be inconsistent, but later reviews notice something that feels quietly consistent. People didn't describe her as unkempt, or lost, or visibly distressed. They described her as controlled, well presented, not talkative but not hostile. That changes how you interpret the practical details in the suitcases, the changes of clothing, the grooming items, the possibility of altering her hair. It begins to look less like an eccentric habit and more like a routine. And routine implies rehearsal. It implies she'd been doing this kind of travel for a while, not just for a single trip in Norway. That can be a difficult thought to sit with, because it suggests she had a life of movement that left very little behind. A later review also looks at the way she signed hotel cards. The handwriting is similar across aliases, but the names themselves vary in style. Some look like they're meant to sound Belgian, or French, or Central European. Some are clumsy, some are smooth. It's as if she had a set of names she rotated through, not all equally convincing. That leads to a practical question. If she used multiple names, did she also use multiple passports, or one altered passport, or no real passport at all, relying on casual checks? Investigators can't answer that fully because the passport itself is not recovered in a usable way. But the question shapes how they approach international inquiries. Instead of only checking the names, they begin checking the patterns. Does a particular passport number format correspond to a real issuing authority? Does it resemble Belgian documents of the era, or is it inconsistent? Does the birth date pattern match what a real traveler would likely claim, or does it look chosen? In some instances, officials respond that the numbers do not correspond to issued documents. In other instances, the response is simply that older records cannot be checked easily, or that no match is found. Again, the consequence is not certainty, but the file becomes more confident that she was not simply using a nickname. She was presenting false identity details as a system. When a case reaches this stage, it often attracts academic attention, or the attention of specialists outside policing, not because the police have failed, because a puzzle like this sits at the boundary between disciplines: language, geography, forensics, document examination, textile origin, and over time, the case becomes a quiet meeting point for those skills. Some specialists focus on the clothing construction. Even with tags removed, garments can be linked to manufacturing regions by stitching, style, fabric composition, and hardware. Buttons and zippers in particular can be surprisingly informative. A zipper brand might be used widely in one region earlier than another. A button style might come from a specific supplier, but clothing also travels. A coat bought in one country can be worn in another for years. So origin isn't identity. It's only one more constraint on the search. It helps you avoid impossible answers. Another group looks at the cosmetics and small containers. Cosmetic packaging changes over time and across markets. A bottle shape might be used in one country for a few years, then replaced. A labeling language, even if partially removed, might leave a trace of what market it was intended for. The consequence of these reviews is a gentle narrowing, not to a single country, but toward a region, toward an understanding that her possessions, taken together, feel European and possibly more central than Scandinavian. Again, it's not a name, it's a quieter kind of map. And then, decades after the first investigation, a different kind of tool becomes available. The kind of tool the original detectives could only have imagined as future work. Advances in forensic science begin to offer new ways to ask old questions. One of those questions is about her physical profile, the details that can be inferred from remains and preserved records. Early forensic work captured a great deal, but later science can sometimes pull more from what was kept. Not always. Only if the material was stored well. Only if enough remains for comparison. So, a new decision is made, in later years, to reopen parts of the case for modern forensic review. This isn't unusual for high-profile unidentified cases. It's a measured step, a request, a careful unsealing of evidence, a recheck of what still exists and what condition it's in. The first part of that work is almost administrative. Locate the boxes, confirm chain of custody, confirm labels, confirm that samples were not contaminated by decades of handling. This is where old discipline pays off, because the more carefully the 1970s team recorded and stored, the more the modern team can trust what they're touching. When preserved samples can be tested, the obvious hope is DNA, but DNA in older cases is not a simple miracle. It depends on whether usable genetic material remains. It depends on whether it was preserved in a way that protects it It depends on whether the right kind of comparison database exists. And even if you generate a profile, you still need a match. A match can come from a criminal database, but only if the person was in it. Or it can come from family comparison, but only if family members are in a reference database and the legal framework allows searching. So, the investigators take a careful approach. They explore what's possible under Norwegian law and practice. They consult forensic labs. They assess what evidence could yield results without destroying what remains. Because with old evidence, you don't get infinite tries. Alongside DNA, another tool becomes more prominent in later reviews. Isotope analysis, a method that can sometimes suggest where a person spent parts of their life, based on chemical signatures in teeth and bones. It doesn't tell you a name. It tells you something about geography, about water sources, about diet patterns that vary regionally. A decision is made, in modern reawakenings of the case, to explore these scientific possibilities. And when results come back, they don't land like a dramatic answer. They land like a careful adjustment to the map. They suggest she likely spent her early life outside Norway. They point toward regions consistent with parts of Europe. They do not point to a street address. Still, the consequence is important. The case becomes less speculative. It becomes more grounded in measurable indicators. And that helps investigators resist the pull of the most glamorous theories. Another development in later years is the willingness to collaborate more openly across borders. In 1970, international cooperation existed, but it was slower and more limited. In later decades, there are more established channels for sharing unidentified person details. There are better databases. There are more standardized missing person systems in many countries. So, Norwegian investigators and later researchers working alongside official efforts circulate her information again. Fingerprints, where possible, dental details, photographs, the list of aliases, the reconstructed travel timeline, the coded notes, at least in summary, and then again, the familiar pattern. Some responses are quick, some are slow, many are negative, and a few are intriguing but unprovable. A dental office in another country might say the work resembles a style they've seen, but without a direct record, it remains an impression. A retired official might say the face looks familiar, but cannot place it. A family might write to say they lost someone decades ago, and the timing feels close. But the comparison doesn't match. Each one is handled with care, because every false match can consume months, and months matter even in a decades-old case. They matter because investigative time is finite, and because the emotional cost to families is real. In this later period, media interest rises again, as it often does with old mysteries. Articles are written, radio segments revisit the story, a new generation hears about the unidentified woman in Isdalen and feels that old human discomfort with a blank space. And with media comes a flood of tips, not always malicious, often sincere. But sincerity doesn't make a tip accurate. So investigators build a system. They log each tip. They rank it by whether it contains verifiable details. They separate identity claims from location claims. They look for documents, photographs, travel records, anything that can be tested. One common kind of tip in cases like this is the claim that she was part of intelligence work. People point to the aliases, the cache, the removed labels, and they draw a line toward espionage. Investigators don't dismiss the possibility out of pride. They simply ask the same question they ask of every theory. What would we expect to find if that were true? And do we have it? They look for corroboration, any documented contact with known intelligence figures, any surveillance records, any official interest at the time that went beyond ordinary policing. And if such records exist, they may be inaccessible, sealed, or never created. So the theory remains what it is. Possible, not provable. Another kind of tip points in a different direction. That she may have been a private person living under assumed identities for personal reasons, escaping a past, escaping a relationship. protecting a child, carrying shame or fear. These are human stories that people recognize because they happen. But again, investigators ask for anchors. Where did she live? What employer? What landlord? What school? What neighbor? A person can be private, but daily life leaves traces. And the tragedy of this case is that the traces are so thin. In the modern reawakening, there is also a more disciplined way to handle the timeline. Instead of a hand-drawn chart pinned to a board, investigators can map routes precisely. They can calculate travel time between hotels. They can check ferry timetables from archived schedules. They can see which movements were plausible within a day and which would have required an overnight. This produces a few modest corrections. A date that may have been misread in a register. A travel leg that would have been difficult without a certain departure time. A hotel stay that now seems more likely to belong to another traveler because the movement doesn't fit. These corrections don't bring a name, but they do something valuable. They make the reconstruction more honest. They reduce the number of uncertain dots, and in long cases, reducing uncertainty is a form of progress. A particularly careful part of the modern work is revisiting the witness statements with a new understanding of memory. Some witnesses gave statements very soon after the events. Those are treated as the strongest. Others came forward years later, after seeing her story in the media. Those are treated gently but cautiously, because the brain can stitch new images into old days. Investigators might recontact surviving witnesses if they can find them, not to interrogate, to clarify, to ask, when you say she spoke German, do you remember the actual words? Sometimes a witness will pause and then offer only a syllable, a greeting, a small phrase said at a counter, and that's useful, because syllables can be checked in a way impressions can't. A clerk might recall that she said thank you in German or asked for a timetable using a French word. Investigators write those fragments down exactly as heard, even if spelling is uncertain. The consequence is quiet but practical, because fragments are less likely to drift over time. When those fragments exist, they're compared against the same woman's documented behavior on hotel cards. Did she fill out a nationality line consistently, or did it shift between stays? Did she speak to staff directly, or keep the conversation to a minimum? Each small answer is another line in a profile that still has no name. And slowly the profile becomes less about where she came from and more about how she moved. In the modern review period, another decision tends to follow naturally. If identity checks fail, you try object checks again, with better tools. You return to the suitcases, not with fresh eyes, but with sharper methods. Textile fibers can be compared more precisely now. Cosmetic residue can be analyzed in more detail. Ink on paper can sometimes be characterized in ways that weren't routine before. This isn't a single lab test. It's a careful planning process, because evidence is finite. Each test consumes a little material. Each handling risks contamination. So investigators choose targets, the items most likely to yield something that points outward. The coded notes are one of those targets. Not because decoding will magically name her, but because the paper itself can hold clues. Ink composition can sometimes suggest a region of manufacture. Paper type can sometimes narrow down a time frame or a market. Even a simple staple or a crease pattern can hint at where the note was carried. Often the result is modest. The ink is the kind sold widely. But even a modest result has a consequence, because it tells you what not to chase. It keeps you from building a theory on a rare object that wasn't rare at all. Investigators also revisit the hotel register cards with modern tools, not to relitigate names, but to catch anything the first review might have missed. A faint pencil line, a clerk's notation in the margin, a room number that ties to a specific location in the building, a date written in a format common in one country and unusual in another. And then comes a development that always sounds small, but can change a case. A clearer understanding of her route allows a clearer understanding of her timing. Once timing is clear, you can ask what else happened nearby, in the same places, on the same days. Not crimes necessarily, just events that draw certain kinds of travelers. In Bergen and the surrounding region, the early 1970s had busy port activity and a steady flow of visitors. Shipping schedules, ferry routes, business travel connected to industry. None of that proves anything, but it offers a calm explanation for why a foreign traveler could blend in while remaining unknown. So investigators begin checking whether any of her known hotels were commonly used by specific groups. Sailors on shore leave, sales representatives, people attending conferences or trade events. If you can link her to a group that had an administrative list, you might find her under a different name. The consequence is more archive work, old event programs, old company records, if they still exist, port authority documents, if accessible. It is slow, and often it yields nothing that can be proven. But it's the kind of methodical search that prevents a case from becoming only folklore. Another thread in the reawakened case involves the woman's physical description and the items that suggest she cared about changing it. If she sometimes altered her hair, that can explain shifting witness descriptions. It can also explain why some sightings never quite fit, even when the timing does. So investigators create a range, not a single picture. They treat her appearance as variable within boundaries. This affects how tips are evaluated. A tipster might say she had dark hair and wore it pinned up. Another might insist she was fair-haired. Instead of discarding one, the file notes that both could be true on different days. The consequence is that fewer tips are thrown away too quickly. But it also means fewer tips can be confirmed, because variability makes matching harder. One of the hardest things to do when a case has lasted for decades is to keep your categories clean. Documented facts on one side, plausible inferences on the other. And then, beyond that, the wide ocean of stories people tell. The modern reviewers have to make decisions about what stays in the core file. A development often comes from this housekeeping. Investigators will create a streamlined timeline, the one they're willing to stand behind in public. And they'll create a secondary timeline, made of softer entries, possibilities, and unverified sightings. This has a consequence for collaboration. When you share the streamlined timeline internationally, you reduce confusion and you reduce false matches. With the streamlined timeline in place, the next decision is usually to reissue the identification requests. Not as a desperate act, as a periodic maintenance action, because databases change. A missing person report filed in one country in 1970 might be digitized decades later. A dental record once stored in a local office might be moved into a national archive. So the same comparisons that failed in the 1970s are tried again. Dental characteristics are sent again through updated channels. Fingerprints are checked again where prints can be compared. And if DNA is available, a profile can be held in readiness for lawful comparison. The consequence is often the same silence, no match. But silence, in long investigations, can still be informative. It tells you that her identity may never have been recorded in the systems you're searching. Or it tells you the records exist, but aren't accessible. Or it tells you she belonged to a world that didn't report its missing in a way governments can see. At this stage, investigators often return to one very simple question. If she was traveling under aliases, why did she keep the coded notes at all? If she wanted to disappear completely, she could have relied on memory, but she wrote something down. That suggests she needed accuracy, and accuracy suggests appointments, or schedules, or a routine that couldn't be trusted to recall alone. So, modern analysts try to interpret the codes not only as place markers, but as a system of movement. They look at the spacing, the repetition, and the way some entries appear to cluster. Do some codes repeat at regular intervals, like check-ins? Do some codes appear only once, like a one-time meeting? The work is careful, because you can convince yourself of patterns that aren't there. When the code interpretation is handled responsibly, it yields a small, steady development. It strengthens confidence in parts of the route, especially when a code aligns with a known hotel stay, and it highlights other codes as unknown stops, genuine blanks. Those blanks become targets, towns where a recheck might still be possible. Sometimes, a recheck finds nothing because the registers are gone, but sometimes, a register survives in a municipal archive or in a hotel's basement, kept by a manager who never threw anything away. And if such a register is found, the next step is simple. Look for the handwriting, look for the habit of paying cash, look for the slight oddness of details that don't verify. A single additional hotel entry can have a real consequence. It can extend the timeline by a day or two, it can confirm a detour, it can reveal she returned to a place rather than passing through once. And returns matter, because returns suggest a reason. Another aspect that gets revisited in modern work is the luggage storage itself. Bergen station was ordinary, but it was also a natural meeting point. People arrive there from many towns. People leave from there to ferries, buses, and hotels. When investigators reconsider the station, they ask whether the act of storing suitcases could have been part of a plan to move lightly for a short time, a plan to retrieve them later, or a plan to leave them behind deliberately, as a kind of severing. That decision point leads to another development in analysis. Investigators pay closer attention to the contents that were in the suitcases, and what was not. A person expecting to travel onward for weeks packs differently than a person expecting to stop soon. They look at the volume and variety, not to romanticize, just to infer intent. If the suitcases contained items that suggest longer travel, then leaving them behind suggests interruption. If they contained only what was needed for the days before the valley, then leaving them behind could be intentional disposal. The consequence is that the suitcases become a kind of clock, not a clock that tells time, but a clock that suggests whether the plan was continuing or ending. There is also a human consequence to this kind of prolonged analysis. Over time, the Isdal Woman stops being a person in the public imagination and becomes an idea. Investigators have to resist that. They keep her as a person in the file, a traveler who ate meals, slept in beds, packed a bag, and left behind objects that were once touched every day. This is why small, respectful details remain important. A comb, a compact, a piece of clothing mended rather than replaced, a choice of shoe that suggests comfort over fashion. These are not investigative fireworks. They are reminders that she lived a daily life, even if we can't name it. As the case continues to receive periodic attention, investigators face another recurring decision: how much to share publicly. Too little, and you miss the one person who might recognize a detail. Too much, and you invite thousands of speculative tips, which can bury the few useful ones. So disclosures are chosen like evidence, carefully weighed. In some reawakenings, specific items are described to the public in hopes of recognition. A particular kind of jewelry, a distinctive cosmetic container, a travel habit linked to a particular hotel. The idea is to trigger recognition in a way that a simple photograph might not. Someone might not recognize a face after decades, but they might recognize a habit or an object or a pattern. The consequence is a new wave of responses. Some are heartfelt, some are vague, a few are oddly specific, the kind that make investigators sit up a little straighter. But specificity creates its own problem, so each response is treated like a small case inside the larger one. Investigators ask, can any part of this be verified? Did the tipster know her in a documented place? Can they produce a photograph? Can they produce a letter? Is there a date that aligns with the timeline? Is there a reason the tipster would have seen her? Each check is a way of turning a story back into evidence. Often, the checks lead to a quiet setback. The photo is lost. The person who might have confirmed it has died. The address no longer exists, and records were never kept. The timeline doesn't match, just by a day, just by a week, but enough to weaken it. The consequence is a familiar one. The case remains open and the tip is filed, but it doesn't change the central facts. Another development in long unsolved cases is the involvement of independent researchers. Some are careful and disciplined, some are less so. The careful ones can be useful because they have time to search archives that police can't prioritize. Old newspapers, shipping schedules, hotel histories. They can sometimes find a document that nudges the official file, but investigators have to make another decision: how to accept outside work without letting the case be pulled into private narratives. So they look for documentation. They ask for sources. They verify. And when something checks out, it's absorbed quietly into the case record. One area where outside research sometimes helps is the reconstruction of the woman's probable daily movements in Bergen. Not only which hotel she stayed in, but what was within walking distance. Which cafes, which shops, which routes to the station. When you map those, you can see how she might have avoided being seen repeatedly, choosing back streets or quieter entrances. And if witnesses remember her appearing and disappearing quickly, the map can make that feel less mysterious. This is another consequence of modern mapping. It demystifies what once seemed like vanishing. In a city with many paths, a person can move quietly without any special skill. The extraordinary part is not that she wasn't seen. The extraordinary part is that she left so little that could be verified afterward. Over the decades, as the case becomes part of Norwegian cultural memory, it also becomes shaped by retellings. Certain details get repeated more than others. Certain theories become familiar. And the danger is that familiarity can start to feel like confirmation. Investigators respond by returning to original documentation again and again. They privilege the first notes, the earliest photographs, the earliest lab reports, and this often leads to another small development. Later retellings may have introduced small errors, a date slightly off, an item described incorrectly, a witness quote simplified. Correcting those errors doesn't solve the case, but it clears the air, and it protects the work from myth. It keeps the file usable. As the modern era continues, another tool becomes part of the case discussion. Genealogical comparison, where lawful and available, can sometimes identify an unknown person through distant relatives. But in Norway, as in many countries, there are legal and ethical boundaries about how DNA can be used. Investigators must decide what is permitted, what is proportionate, and what is respectful. A person without a name is still a person with rights. So the case proceeds cautiously. If DNA work is done, it's done with clear oversight. The results, if any, are handled as sensitive information, not as entertainment. And even then, the consequence may be no match, because a match requires other people's data to exist in the system. An unknown woman who avoided records might also come from a family line that never entered modern databases. This is one of the central frustrations of the Isdal Woman case. Modern tools are powerful, but they still depend on comparison. They still depend on someone, somewhere, having a record. And if her life was lived between systems, then even modern science can end up staring into the same blank space. Because of that, investigators keep doing something that seems old-fashioned. They keep returning to paper, to the hotel cards, to the station logs, to the small items in the suitcases. Because sometimes, a single overlooked name in a margin is more useful than a dozen broad theories. There is also the question of the addresses she wrote down, the ones that appear on some hotel cards. Even if the addresses were false, they were chosen. And chosen things can have patterns. Investigators look at whether those addresses cluster in certain cities, whether street names repeat, whether the numbers correspond to real buildings. Sometimes they find that an address is real but belongs to a non-residential place, an office building, a public institution, a place where mail could be collected. The consequence is subtle. It suggests that some of her false details may have been designed to survive casual checking, not only made up, but selected. And selection implies she knew those places, or had access to a source that did. A guidebook, a contact, a directory. Again, it doesn't give a name. It gives a sense of competence. With competence established, investigators revisit an older question. Was she alone in her planning? Or was she following instructions? To approach that without drifting into fiction, they ask a grounded version. Which parts of her routine would be easier with support? Regular money exchange, reliable transport between towns, access to false documentation, and which parts would be easy alone? Choosing quiet hotels, paying cash, removing labels. This kind of split helps investigators focus. If they want to test the possibility of support, they look for evidence that requires another person. A phone call placed repeatedly to the same number. A meeting witnessed more than once. A message